Thank you very much. It's been a couple years since I spoke to you all. Pretty good years. The years leading up to that, none of the teams from my hometown of Washington, D.C., nor Kansas City had done very well. The last few years, on the other hand, have seen the Royals win the World Series and, above all, the Washington Capitals win the Stanley Cup finally. And, of course, the Nationals just won the World Series. And we'll see what happens with the Chiefs this year, right? Patrick Mahomes is going to play, which I think is a bit of a mistake. They should wait till the end of the year to make sure he's there to bring about what we all want, which is to see the Patriots lose.
First in war, first in peace, and first in the National League?
No, it is first in war, first in peace, last in the NFC East.
It used to be first in war, first in peace, last in the American League.
Not anymore. Now with our the Washington Indigenous Persons Football Club is just hopeless, utterly freaking hopeless, to quote Crash Davis.
First Nations.
Okay. All right. We all had a good meal tonight. We had some good Italian food. Last night we had turkey for dinner, which was Thanksgiving, which left everybody all tryptophaned up for their for an audience, but it was still pretty good. It's not as bad as one experience I had when I gave a lecture to a seminar, I think it was in Southern Illinois, and it was held at some big Amish kitchen place.
In Arcola.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yoder's Country Kitchen.
That's it. And I had the after lunch speaking slot.
Oh, my God.
So the next time they asked me to come, I asked them that I wanted to have the first session in the morning. So they gave it to me, and I ate well that day. So all right. So we're going to talk about the Valley Campaign here. Again, mentioning that in the aftermath of Bud Robertson's passing, that's kind of a sad. And as I mentioned, something you two had in common is that in addition to being a great historian, Bud Robertson was also a football referee, college football referee as well. So interesting. But we'll talk about someone who is very near and dear to his heart, which is Tom Jackson. Not this one. This is my talk to the Denver Roundtable. So I know, Jim. This is last night's joke, right? Okay. So, but
Audience, it still works.
yeah, they did. Okay. All right. Always good to try material on new groups. All right. Now, what do they break on here? We're not going to be stuck with this guy on that, are we? Can you click advance? Can someone advance that? Because this clicker is. I've killed it. I've murdered it. Let me see. Did I slide something wrong?
Did you turn off the power accidentally? There's a slide on the side there that's got to be forward.
Yeah, if it's on red, I guess it's off. If it's on, could someone just advance the slide for me? That'll just make it go. And just move your chair up there. Or that one right there. Something seems to be froze up altogether. Oh well. While it gets repaired, I will talk a bit off my notes. I'll talk about Tom Jackson, the Thomas J. Jackson. Born in Western Virginia. Were you all going to West Virginia, correct? Yes. So are you going to go visit the Jackson's Mill, the place where he grew up? All right, there we go. Who's putting together the itinerary for West Virginia?
She's not here.
She's not here tonight. Do you have any idea what you guys are going to be covering or looking at, or? West Virginia.
Her husband might.
Okay, you will be going to West Virginia, and you will be seeing West Virginia. I suspect you'll see some mountains.
Cheat Mountain.
Probably Cheat Mountain, I presume, Rich Mountain and places like that. Okay.
Oh, I think also.
McDowell is, I think it may be in West Virginia. Okay. But, so, again, Jackson's Mill. Jackson was born in Clarksburg, which is now West Virginia, which, of course, was the Unionist part of Virginia, kind of an irony there. And his younger sister, Laura, became a notorious Unionist in Western Virginia. And that became a bit of a source of family issue. Jackson was born, again, Clarksburg, Tennessee, the 21st of January, 1824. His father died when Jackson was young, and his mother was unable to handle the responsibilities of raising him, so he spends most of his youth at what's called Jackson's Mill, owned by his uncle Cummins Jackson. Here is some pictures of the site. There's the mill, and here's a picture of my daughter here by the pond by the mill. That's from, I think, 2011. She's much older now. Now she's 16. God bless her, and God save me. It's amazing, though. I mean, 16-year-olds these days aren't as obsessed with getting their driver's license as I remember. I don't even deal with 16-year-olds. I try to encourage my daughter to get her driver's license. She's not really interested, I guess, because they can't communicate with each other by phone. They don't need to go drive over to people's houses anymore, which, you know, fine. That's cheaper insurance bills for me for a while. But we paid a visit to Weston and Jackson's Mill, and it's preserved and it's maintained by West Virginia University. It's really, I highly recommend it. So it's a good couple hours there. But Jackson spends most of his formative years at Jackson's Mill, and he gets some relatively rudimentary education, the best you could really get in West Virginia at the time. Oh, you guys want West Virginia jokes, okay? Nah, I'm not going to go there. I'm being recorded, okay? But I can show you some things offline if you have some. See, that's what a friend of mine pointed out. The mistake that West Virginia made was they should have called themselves just Virginia and made Eastern Virginia, the red parts, the Confederate parts, rename themselves so that they could. But I don't understand. All right. Okay, so Jackson's Mill, he's raised there, and as he moves into young adulthood, he spends some time as a school teacher and as a local constable, and is headed pretty much to a life of obscurity. Then he gets a big break, and a distant relative is a member of Congress and has an opening to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point, beat Navy. So I noticed your shirt over there.
Yeah.
So, okay, 3 years in a row going on. Okay. So speaking of sports teams that are doing better, right? Army broke their 13 losing streak and have won 3 in a row against Navy. So that's a good thing. So his distant relative is a member of Congress, has an opening to attend the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and 2 local residents in the district try out for it, essentially, and Jackson doesn't get the selection. The other young kid does. The other kid does. And then in 1842, June of 1842, this appointee to West Point makes the long travel from Western Virginia and up the Hudson River, the beautiful Hudson River, up to West Point. Gets off the boat, gets up to the plane, and decides that it's not for him. He gets back on the boat, heads back down the Hudson River, and news reaches Western Virginia that the opening this opening for the appointment to West Point is open again. And Jackson finds out about it. He travels to Washington, D.C., meets with the congressman. He says, sure, well, I guess that's the choice. Go up there. And so he heads up to West Point in June of 1842 to join the famous class of 1846. And he does so, many observers say, by the skin of his teeth. Because when he got up to West Point, one of the first things you have to do, first of all, you get the appointment to West Point from your congressman. But then there's a series of entrance exams you have to do, which are very heavy in mathematics and things that Jackson had not had a lot of exposure to. I mean, some people, like the classmate who will finish second in the class of 1846, who is?
McClellan.
George Brinton McClellan, right? He already attended the University of Pennsylvania for a couple of years. So some of them had very little trouble with these exams, but not Jackson. Jackson had a hard time. One observer later said when Jackson got called to the blackboard to do the problem assigned, he never saw a man sweat so much in his life. He said Jackson tried to wipe his brow with his sleeves, and after a while that didn't help at all because the sleeves were all soaked. But he does pass these exams, and he enters the class of 1846, and very few people are predicting greatness for this guy. But over the course of his 4 years at West Point, the best 48 months of his life, 47 months is how they're selling, the 47-month experience at West Point, he does impress his classmates with his determination to get through. He overcomes his relative lack of academic preparation and performs relatively well at West Point. He manages to rise to the middle of the class. He rises gradually, steadily, year by year in the class rankings, which are extremely important because your class rankings dictate what branch you can join in the Army. So he eventually moves into the middle of his class, graduates 17th in 1846, and is commissioned into the artillery, which is a fairly prestigious appointment because artillery and engineering were the two most prestigious branches, most technical branches in the United States Army. So this is an indication that some people saw something in Jackson. Now, when he was at West Point during his wonderful experience up there, if you go to West Point now, I mean, the physical grounds of West Point are very different from, but if you want to get a sense of what Jackson's experience might have been, one thing Jackson often did when he needed some time alone or just to take a little mental break, he would often go up to Fort Putnam, which is an old Revolutionary War fortification. If you go to West Point on the plain, how many of you have been to West Point? Okay. If you go to the plain, there's a fort overlooking the plain that's been reconstructed, and that's Fort Putnam. And it was in ruins at the time to provide Jackson a place where he could be by himself and kind of reflect on what he was doing, get a little bit of a mental break from the stress of the academy. And undoubtedly what helped Jackson in this psychologically is the fact that if you go to Jackson's Mill and you go to West Point, the topography of the area is very, very similar. So undoubtedly the mountainous region around West Point, the scenery, helped Jackson somewhat as he struggled to get through West Point. So he graduates in 1846, and like most West Point graduates, he's looking forward to joining the United States Army, which unfortunately probably means you're going to be chasing Indians around the frontier. But fortunately for Jackson, he graduates in 1846, and he and the rest of his class are going to go fight a real war against a real army and a real enemy, and that is going to be against the Mexicans. He initially reports to his, He reports to his initial posting is in New York, and he meets with his commander, and then they leave from New York to head to the scene of war in Mexico. In the Mexican War, he distinguishes himself in the campaigns against Mexico City. He wins a number of brevet promotions, which are honorary promotions. They didn't really give medals back then the way they do today. If you did well in combat or in some other function, you received a brevet or honorary promotion. So while your official rank and pay, no money with the honor, your official rank would be first or second lieutenant, you could be a brevet captain or a brevet major, and you could be honorarily called major by other people. Except when you were in a U.S. Army regular, then you were just, once again, stinking lieutenant again. But he serves well and performs well in the Mexican campaigns. He makes friendships, especially with D.H. Hill, Daniel Harvey Hill, who's going to be important because Jackson's second wife is going to be the sister of Daniel Harvey Hill's wife. So after Mexico, it's back to garrison duty, but fortunately for him, at least it doesn't look like he's going to have to chase Indians around. He gets posted at Fort Hamilton, which is the fort that guards the entrance to New York Harbor. If any of you have been to New Jersey, Fort Hamilton, the remnants are still there. It's a pretty cool site at the entrance to New York Harbor. He does have some issues at Fort Hamilton with authority. His commanding officer, a lot of the young lieutenants and young soldiers came back having grown mustaches from their service in Mexico, and their new commander decides that mustaches must go. And that commander is in the lower left-hand corner here. He's a colonel. Anybody recognize this guy? You've heard the name, but you probably don't know who it is. His name he's Colonel Ichabod Crane. Okay? Who, in the War of 1812, had served in New York, the state of New York, and undoubtedly, although there's no established document in which Washington Irving says Ichabod Crane is Ichabod Crane, Ichabod Crane probably is, he probably heard this name Ichabod Crane, because it is really a kind of a cool name if you're trying to write a horror film, right? So he probably said, you can't make this name up, okay? So that's probably where the name Ichabod Crane comes from Sleepy Hollow. But he is Jackson's senior officer and decides to get back into the good old peacetime routine. They can't grow mustaches anymore. And this is causes some tension in the command relationship, which, as I mentioned last night, that was a funny thing because last year at West Point, the summer before I got there, the cadets had decided they wanted to grow mustaches at summer training. And they followed the regulations, and the brigade commander decided regulations or not, the cadets were not going to have mustaches. And then when classes started, I heard all about it. Oh, this mean old colonel says we can't have mustaches. It says in the regs. Well, that's, some things change and some things don't in the Army. But he serves for a while this artillery unit in Fort Hamilton, and then he gets assigned the task, which is the real mission of the United States Army for most of its history, even though the United States Army tries to deny it, which is nation building and wide area security and counterinsurgency operations. He goes down to Florida to help deal with the Seminoles, who have caused trouble not once, not twice, but thrice with the United States over the United States wanted them out of Florida for reasons I don't understand, because Florida is not one of my favorite places in the world. But the Seminoles liked it, okay? He's posted a place called Fort Meade. Anybody recognize the name Meade? No. This is named for George Gordon Meade. This fort down there is named for George Gordon Meade, who was an engineer officer who had served there, and the fort was named after Meade. He serves there, and it's not a happy experience for Stonewall Jackson. He's got a problem with the senior officer, and it's not just with mustaches. It's a guy by the name of William French. You've studied Antietam, you've studied Gettysburg. He wasn't at Gettysburg, but after Gettysburg, takes me on 3rd Corps. Or if you read about getting lost in the woods during the Mine Run campaign, that William French is your man, okay? He and Jackson do not get along well, and they have an unseemly back and forth, and then finally Jackson decides he gets another job opportunity, decides I will take that other job opportunity. He leaves the swamps of Florida for the wonderful, wonderful region of the Shenandoah Valley, okay? So he arrives in Shenandoah Valley. He's got a job offer with the Virginia Military Institute, which undoubtedly Daniel Harvey Hill probably played a role in because he was teaching at Washington College right next door. They needed a new instructor who could teach military instruction and also teach what's called natural and scientific philosophy. And Hill thinks of his old Mexican War comrade, Thomas J. Jackson, and the superintendent of VMI decides to extend Thomas Jackson a position as a faculty member. And he did it without Jackson ever having to publish anything. So some things do change, okay? So he gets on the faculty at VMI, and everybody who studied Jackson, of course, has said that Jackson as an instructor wasn't the best instructor. In his military leadership, when he gave instruction to the cadets at VMI, especially on artillery, and when things required discipline, Jackson was very much respected by the cadets, but in the classroom he was not very much respected at all. The nickname Tom Fool got attached to him because his teaching style was not really a style. He would memorize the lecture and then try to deliver the lecture verbatim as he memorized it, and if anything interrupted in it, it would create problems, and he did not be a very good instructor. And there were, of course, the stories of cadets who threatened to fight duels with him because they didn't like him. And keep in mind, VMI gets, cadets from some of the top crust of Virginia society. So when they're being corrected by this seedy guy, a former U.S. Army guy who is a major but only honorary major, not really a real major, it creates tensions. And the superintendent, Francis Smith, is constantly having to put out fires and complaints about Jackson's teaching. But nonetheless, Jackson does make a happy life for himself in Lexington. He marries twice. His first marriage ends when his wife dies in childbirth. And then he marries the sister-in-law of Daniel Harvey Hill. In addition, Jackson makes a trip while he's at VMI to Europe and tours various battlefields and historic sites, and later tells his friends never to ask him about his trip to Europe unless they got a couple hours to kill, because Jackson will tell them all about it. He had such a good time. And when Jackson has his honeymoons, he has both of his honeymoons. He goes up to Canada, to Quebec, and he goes to the battlefield of Quebec and the Wolfe Monument there. So Jackson clearly had some understanding of military history and had an interest in it. And those of us who teach military history and believe in its value to Army officers often like Jackson for that reason, because he makes a case for our having jobs. Okay, so while he's at VMI, in addition, in 1859, when John Brown is executed at Charlestown, Virginia, VMI is asked to provide cadets to provide security, and Jackson leads the cadets up there and witnesses the execution of John Brown. Like most regular Army officers, Jackson is not a big enthusiast for secession, but when the state decides to secede, in response to Lincoln's calls for troops, Jackson offers his services, and his first service is to lead the cadets to Richmond so they can serve as drill masters for Virginia's new troops. And after he does this for a while, Jackson gets appointed as a colonel, and he is sent to take command at Harper's Ferry, where he begins establishing order and drill and discipline. And the regiments that are under his direction will later be brought together to form the Stonewall Brigade. Although while he's there, he's superseded by Joseph Johnston, who takes command at Harper's Ferry, and then leads Jackson's command and the other units in the Shenandoah Valley to Manassas to fight the First Battle of Manassas, where Jackson wins his famous nickname, Stonewall. And if you want to discuss the circumstances about this, because people say it wasn't as complimentary as Jackson admirers would have it to be, it certainly is an ironic nickname, as we'll see from the campaign we're going to focus on in a little bit tonight. Okay. So he's known as, he gets the nickname Stonewall, commander of the Stonewall Brigade for the performance at First Manassas. And then he gets sent out to the Shenandoah Valley, where he is going to be the leader who's got to deal with a team of guys. Okay? And here they are. And as I mentioned last night, they are the blue team. Okay? You know what blue team means, right? You know why they're the blue team? One, they're wearing blue uniforms. You could have gone with the obvious one, okay? That's what I often tell my students, you know, if I throw out an answer and you think throw out a question, you think there's an obvious answer, try the obvious answer, okay? That can. But the other reason the blue team is, of course, in blue forces, those are always the good guys, the trackers and in your forces. The other bad guys are the red team. So this is the blue team of both sense. Now, okay, I'm not getting a response to that, all right? This is something I do and need to clarify if I'm giving a talk in, say, Virginia or Georgia or Tennessee, okay? When they say blue teams because they're uniforms, and you go, yeah, okay. It's the uniforms. But these are the good guys. Everybody know, people in Chicago know these are the good guys, correct?
Yeah.
All right, no debate, no discussion there. What's that?
You're in Illinois.
Yeah.
I know, but sometimes sometimes, you know, you head down to parts of the country and you got to know your audience. Okay? So, here's the members of the blue team. Of course, the top of the team is going to be Abraham Lincoln, as mentioned there, and his Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, who are in charge of the situation. Because in March of 1862, they decide they no longer need a general-in-chief, a man in uniform to be the commander of all the Union armies. That man at the time was George McClellan, and issues, okay, come up. And one rationalization is because McClellan's getting ready to do the campaign on the lower Chesapeake Bay, that they want McClellan to be able to focus all his effort on the Army of the Potomac. But in reality, it is a vote of no confidence in McClellan's leadership over tensions that developed between Lincoln and McClellan and Stanton. So, having removed McClellan as the commanding general of the Army, they name no replacement, and so Lincoln and Edwin Stanton are going to be the de facto generals-in-chief of the Union armies who've got to deal with the problem of the Shenandoah Valley. Okay, they've got to coordinate all the operations all throughout Virginia that are going on in early 1862. And this is going to be proved to be quite a challenge. One that they do not exactly pull off. Well, the results kind of speak for themselves. That's Lincoln and that's Stanton. And members of their team, you got this gentleman here, the Bobbin Boy of Massachusetts, Nathaniel Banks, who is appointed to command of forces in McClellan's army that are upstream up the Potomac from Washington, D.C., and consequently, they're going to play a large role in the Shenandoah Valley campaign. He is a non-West Point graduate, but hey, he's a former Speaker of the House. Who would doubt whether a Speaker of the House could be a good general, right? Who's the Speaker of the House? Oh, man, imagine 4 years, General Pelosi. Man, I could see that. What's that? Okay, and all right, back, I mentioned something. Remember, Jackson finishes middle of his class. Everybody knows who finishes last in the class of 1846, correct? Who's that?
Pickett.
George Armstrong Pickett. Custer finishes last in his class of 1860 or 61. I think, I get those two confused. And again, this is what I point out, because of course Custer, he finishes last in his class at West Point, right? And so, what's the greatest military disaster of the United States in the entire 19th century? Little Bighorn, right? So, you go to cadets and say, see, do your homework, right? And then, of course, the worst disaster of the 20th century is what happens in Korea when the Chinese attack, where the commander is Douglas MacArthur, who finished first in his class at West Point. Safety and mediocrity. Okay? Safety and mediocrity. All right? Who finished, and here's a question I asked last night, so you don't get to answer it. Who finished first in the class of 1846? Lee is much older than that. Everybody knows who finishes number 2, right? Little Mac, George McClellan. Okay, number 1 is, okay, this is something that I usually commend audiences on, because you don't need to know this, okay? It's a fellow by the name of Charles Stewart from New York. He stays ahead of most of McClellan the whole 4 years. And that's like the ultimate kind of trivia question. Of course, Lee finished second in his class at West Point. So another trivia question is a fellow by the name of Charles Mason, who later goes out to Iowa and does some interesting engineering stuff as well. So if you know the answers to those two questions, you finished ahead of George McClellan and Robert E. Lee, I suggest that you find things to do with your life, because as much as I love your interest in the Civil War, that's good. That's pushing it. Okay, so back to some of the other people. Another non-West Pointer. One of the very few non-West Point West Pointers who gets commissioned in the United States Army after the War of 1812, after there's been reforms to the Army after the War of 1812, and that's John C. Fremont. Okay, who becomes famous as the Pathfinder. He writes some of these great accounts of his explorations in the West. He plays a large role in the California Revolt in 1846, and is the Republican Party's first presidential candidate in 1856. They got to find an important job for him. They initially give it to him in Missouri, and it doesn't work out so well. Okay, and but one thing he does do in Missouri is he declares he wants to liberate slaves. And oh man, you say that, the Republicans in Congress are going to make sure you get an important job. And on the March 11th orders, in which McClellan is removed as General-in-Chief, a new mountain department is created so that John C. Fremont will have an important command. And this mission is a reflection of this larger shakeup. Under McClellan's leadership, there were 3 major areas of operations. Virginia, Halleck's department along the Mississippi River, and Buell's command, which is supposed to operate against, Don Carlos Buell's command, was supposed to operate against East Tennessee. Okay? With the command shakeup, Halleck's and Buell's commands are combined under Halleck's command, and Halleck orders Buell to come to Western Tennessee, forget about East Tennessee for a while. That's going to lead to Buell being at the Battle of Shiloh. Okay? That leaves the question of what do you do about East Tennessee? And Lincoln and Stanton figure out, we know what's going to happen. We'll put John C. Fremont in command of forces in West Virginia, and they'll march south from West Virginia through the mountains to Knoxville, East Tennessee. And if that sounds logistically kind of kooky to you, no one said that Lincoln and Stanton were logisticians. Okay? But this mountain department is going to figure importantly because these are mountains that are west of the Shenandoah Valley. And finally, in the your lower right-hand corner, there is James Shields, another political general who had been a division commander in the Mexican War, and he has a history with Lincoln because Shields was an important Democrat before the war. Lincoln was an important Republican, and the two of them very nearly fight a duel. But Lincoln can set that aside and give Shields an important command in the Shenandoah Valley. So these are some names that are going to pop up as we talk about Jackson and what he's doing in the Shenandoah Valley. Any questions on these guys? I know, you're just inspired looking at pictures of Nathan Banks and John C. Fremont. They inspire me too. All right, so next one. Okay, so November 1861. After the Battle of Manassas, Jackson is a division commander in the forces that are around Manassas and Centerville. And Jefferson Davis in October pays a visit to the Army, and he talks to some of their commanders, and Jackson lets it be known that he's interested in the situation in the Shenandoah Valley. People in the Shenandoah Valley are complaining that since Johnston's army left the valley to go to Manassas, the Union soldiers have been prowling around the lower valley. Of course, everybody knows when we talk lower Shenandoah Valley, we're talking the northern end, correct? So you go down the valley when you're going north. Upper Shenandoah Valley is the southern end. So when you go up the valley, you're actually heading south. Okay, so we're clear on that? All right, it's Virginia. Okay, it's one of the curiosities. Jackson makes clear that he's interested in the situation in the Shenandoah Valley. People in the Shenandoah Valley are writing to the government in Virginia, and Davis already thinks we need to do some reorganization of the Confederate forces in Virginia. So what's created in late October is the Department of Northern Virginia. The overall commander is Joe Johnston. There is an Acquired district under General Holmes. There is a Potomac district under the command of P.G.T. Beauregard. And there's going to be a Valley district under the command of Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. Jackson is sent out to the Valley. He arrives there on the 4th of November. And he looks at a situation. He sees threats from two sides. One is there is a federal force at a town called Romney, which we'll talk about a little bit. It's up there in the map. I sometimes forget my own maps. Up there in Romney, which is to the west of Winchester, and there's a good turnpike that connects Romney and Winchester, and Jackson is concerned that federal forces there, commanded by Frederick Lander, may advance on Winchester, while some of Banks's command advance on Winchester from the north, from the direction of Harper's Ferry and Charlestown. That could be the plan for their 62 campaign. And Jackson's attitude and opinion towards military operations is the best defense is a good offense. And so once he gets out to Winchester, he requests to have the Stonewall Brigade brought to him, and they decide to transfer the Stonewall Brigade from Beauregard's command to Jackson's command. And the second it arrives, Jackson starts proposing, I want to go and attack the federal forces at Romney and eliminate that potential danger. In order to do this, however, the Stonewall Brigade is not enough, and so he finds out there's 3 brigades commanded by William Woods Loring, elsewhere in Western Virginia. He asked for those to be sent to Winchester so he can take offensive operations against Romney. Richmond agrees. Loring is sent to Winchester. And on the 1st of January, 1862, the campaign season opens up in Virginia, and with Stonewall Jackson marching his army west of Winchester, headed toward Romney. Now, those of you who are thinking military operations in the mountains of West Virginia in January are a bad idea, your name is General Loring, who raised objections to this potential operation. But nonetheless, Jackson's determined to take the offensive. And it turns out in the 1st of January, 1862, it's a warm, unseasonably clear day in the mountains of West Virginia. And the first day they make progress, and they manage to reach a small crossroads called Unger's Store, where Jackson's plan is not to head directly to Romney. That would be too obvious. And Jackson always likes to mystify and surprise his opponents. And to make sure his opponents are mystified and surprised, he doesn't share his plans with subordinates. So his subordinates are often mystified and surprised as well, which creates problems here because Loring thinks this is a bad idea, this whole campaign's a bad idea, and he and Jackson have friction with each other all throughout the campaign, all throughout the operation. In addition, the Stonewall Brigade has a new commander by the name of Richard Garnett, and there's going to be tension between Jackson and Garnett until Jackson removes Garnett from command, has him court-martialed, and if you've seen the movie Gettysburg, what happens in that result. So what happens is they reach Unger's Store, And unfortunately, on the night of the 1st and the 2nd, a cold front comes through, and the mountains of West Virginia in January become what the mountains of West Virginia are supposed to be in January. Cold, unpleasant, snowy, and haily. And so, but Jackson's not going to stop. He decides to head north to the town of Bath because there's a Union garrison there. And the idea is if he can get to the Potomac River, he might be able to cut the C&O Canal and the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad. He captures the town of Bath on the 4th of January, and then on the night of the 5th and 6th after that night, a big snowstorm comes in, and Jackson brings up his artillery and fires on the town of Hancock, Maryland. Frederick Lander arrives there during the night. Jackson sends a request for surrender of the town of Hancock, and Lander sends he sends Turner Ashby to deliver the surrender note. And Lander says Jackson to bombard this place to be damned. There's just a bunch of secessionists who live here anyway. And so Lander's not going to surrender the town, and Jackson can throw artillery at the town, but he really can't get across the river to attack it. So after 2 days of misery at Hancock in the snow, where, as you see here, there's an uninterrupted sheet of ice. They're marching over ice. The horses are giving out. The horses are chewing the bark off of trees in order to try to get some kind of nutrition because the supply wagons can't catch up. And when Richard Garnett lets the Stonewall Brigade rest and give time for the wagons to catch up, Jackson is going to berate him verbally and criticize him. And so the tensions develop all throughout this huge, miserable campaign. And they said at one point in the night, they sleep through the night, snow falls down, and they said it looked like a freshly buried graveyard with all these mounds all over the ground. And then when Reveille broke, you saw all the dead people come to life in the Confederate Army. It sounds like a wonderful, wonderful scene to look at, but probably pretty terrible to be part of. And so the Army falls back to Unger Store, the crossroads there, where Jackson can recoup his men, hopefully rehabilitate them, get some wagons up, and then go for Romney. The camp is initially at Unger Store. They initially call it Camp Mud. And so they decide to move the camp to what they call Camp No Better. And while they're there, word arrives that the Federals have abandoned Romney. So Jackson marches his army to Romney, captures the town. There's no Federals there. And then decides to return the Stonewall Brigade back to Winchester and leave Loring's 3 brigades to occupy Romney, which is a miserable little town. I'm sure people who live there love it, okay? But the universal letters are all, what a miserable little town this is. It's a dirty little town. We don't want to be here. We're occupied. We don't see the value of being here. And this leads to a command crisis because Loring writes to Richmond complaining about Jackson's leadership and saying we can't keep our 3 brigades here in Romney. We can't sustain them. There's no good bivouac here in Romney. And they write back to Richmond, and Richmond, the Secretary of War, Judah Benjamin, sends an order to Jackson to have Loring's command evacuate Romney. Jackson complies, but is very unhappy, as any commander would be, with the Secretary of War interfering in what he deems to be operational decisions with his command, and Jackson submits his resignation as commander and asked to be reassigned back to the Virginia Military Institute. Joe Johnston objects to the resignation and writes himself, hey, I don't want the Secretary of War interfering in my command either. And it becomes a controversy. Congressman Alexander Butler goes back between Jackson and Richmond and manages to cool Jackson down and get some assurances from Davis and Benjamin that they will be a little less provocative in dealing with Stonewall Jackson. In addition, Jackson was upset with Garnett's command. Many of the soldiers in the Stonewall Brigade are complaining about the situation, complaining about the campaign, and wondering what they accomplished for all the suffering that they endured. They captured Romney, but the Federals had evacuated it anyway. So it's a very, very unhappy command that Jackson has. That has to deal with the advance of Union Army, in serious advance of the Union Army into the lower Shenandoah Valley in late February and early March of 1862. What happens is Lander's command, which because Lander gets sick and dies, comes under the command of James Shields. Shields' command and Banks' command link up for an advance on Winchester, which is the principal settlement in the lower Shenandoah Valley. Jackson's initial impulse is to attack them, but he recognizes quickly he does not have the logistical means or the troop strength to do so successfully, and Jackson begins retreating south from Winchester and evacuates the town. Once Winchester is occupied, the plan that the Union High Command, that George McClellan has worked out for protecting Washington while the Army of the Potomac is operating on the peninsula, the Federals begin putting that into effect, which is a plan that Banks will eventually move his command to northern Virginia to be in front of Washington, D.C. and protect it. That will enable McClellan's corps, 5 corps, to leave for the peninsula with Washington being secure. And Jackson and Richmond recognize this is a potential danger, and as Jackson is falling back and recovering from the loss of Winchester, he begins looking for an opportunity. And when Banks begins sending part of his command over the Blue Ridge Mountains into northern Virginia to carry out McClellan's plan, Jackson decides he's got an opportunity for successful offensive. And this leads on the 22nd and 23rd of March to the Battle of Kearnstown, in which Jackson suffers a terrible tactical defeat and is forced to retreat back up the valley, having been beaten. However, although a tactical defeat, Kearnstown has a positive effect for the Confederacy because the Lincoln administration, which is already very nervous about McClellan's plan to go to the peninsula, orders Banks' entire command to stay in the Shenandoah Valley. And to take the place of Banks' command in front of Washington, Lincoln and Stanton decide to hold Irvin McDowell's 35,000-man corps in front of Washington, which causes all kinds of complaints by McClellan that we don't have time to get into, undermines his plans for Yorktown, and contributes to McClellan's victim story on the peninsula. So the defeat at Kearnstown, although the tactical defeat, is a positive operational development for the Confederacy because it leads to the holding back of forces from McClellan's army. And this is going to be the big story of the Shenandoah Valley campaign as it continues. So despite the fact Jackson's men have to retreat, they fall back all the way to Conrad's Store. As they receive word that McDowell's command has stayed in northern Virginia, Banks' entire command is staying in the Shenandoah Valley. Jackson and his men begin thinking, maybe we lost the Battle of Kearnstown, but we actually gained something of significance from it, which confirms Jackson. Offensive action is a good thing. Again, he's taken offensive action twice in Romney and Kearnstown, both of which would raise questions about his military judgment, and yet he stays in command, which gives us a pretty good sign of Confederate military culture that as long as you're aggressive, you will keep your command. Go forward. All right. So Jackson falls back all the way up the Shenandoah Valley, south of Massanet Mountain, to a small place called Conrad's Store. He moves to this position so that if Banks decides to try to follow up his victory at Kearnstown by marching as far south as Staunton, Virginia, Jackson's command at Conrad's Store will be on his flank. And so Banks is going to advance all the way to Harrisonburg, but he's going to stop there because he can't logistically sustain himself going any further south. And this kind of sets up a situation where Banks' command stays at Harrisonburg and is going to be separated from Fremont's command, the lead elements from which are pushing east through the mountains under the direction of Brigadier General Robert H. Milroy, who is an aggressive dude. And Jackson, seeing that Milroy is coming his way, seeing the situation with Banks, Richmond orders a division commanded by Richard Ewell, which is the one division Johnston had left behind in northern Virginia when Johnston's army went to the peninsula to deal with McClellan at Yorktown. He left behind Ewell's command, Ewell's division, and Ewell has some vague ideas of carrying offensive operations, perhaps threatening Washington, but eventually, with Jackson's falling back to Conrad's Store, Ewell is ordered to fall back in the direction of Swift Run Gap, which is on the other side of the Blue Ridge from Conrad's Store, so he can be positioned to cooperate with Jackson if Jackson tries to do anything in the valley. So here on the red, you see Ewell's command moving towards Conrad's Store. Ewell shows up at Swift Run Gap. He goes to Conrad's Store, and on the 30th of April, Jackson leaves and takes his army west to the mountains to deal with Milroy's command, which is going to be a source of frustration to Ewell because he finds no directions behind in terms of what he's supposed to do while Jackson is gone, which is going to lead to a lot of complaining on Richard Ewell's part about how Jackson's a foolish and a crazy man because he asked me to come to Conrad to Swift Run Gap. I thought I was supposed to cooperate with his command. I get to Swift Run Gap, and Jackson and his commander are gone off to the west to go chase the mountains or something like that. But what happens is Jackson heads south and then takes the train to Stanton. He arrives there on the 5th of May, and he does something significant, and that is, 1, he gets a haircut, and 2, he finally gets rid of his blue United States Army uniform and gets a gray Confederate uniform. So if you see pictures of Jackson, or paintings of Jackson at 1st Manassas wearing a gray uniform, he was actually wearing a blue uniform that day. He doesn't get his gray uniform until he gets to Stanton, and I guess he figured, new uniform, new haircut, life will be good. And after Stanton, he finds out that Milroy's coming toward him, that Milroy is reached the town of McDowell. Jackson goes to meet him. He links up with a Confederate force commanded by Edward Allegheny Johnson. They link up. They establish a position on Sitlington's Hill, which overlooks the town of McDowell. Milroy, being a combative kind of guy, decides to attack into a mountain a couple times. As you might imagine, it doesn't work out so well. Milroy is defeated at the Battle of McDowell and ends up retreating north through the mountains toward the town of Franklin. And with that, click that forward, Jackson begins looking at what can I do about Nathaniel Banks. What happens is while Jackson is dealing with Milroy's command at McDowell, Washington orders Banks to send one of his division, James Shields' division, east to Fredericksburg, where it would join the force there commanded by Irvin McDowell. And from Fredericksburg, Shields' command, the rest of McDowell's command, will move south toward Richmond, link up with McClellan's army, and together McDowell's command and McClellan's army will conduct the final operations to capture Richmond and end the war. Yippee, 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 right? Okay, so that's the idea. So Shields is sent east, and Jackson, after he's defeated Milroy McDowell, says, here's an opportunity for us to go after Nathaniel Banks and defeat him. So he orders Ewell to head north up the Luray Valley, which is the valley between Massanutten Mountain and the Blue Ridge. If you studied the Shenandoah Valley, right? You know the Shenandoah Valley, right? Geographically, is where we're talking operations. Isn't really one valley. It's one valley until you get to Strasburg in Front Royal, and then it splits into 2 valleys by Massanutten Mountain. The Shenandoah Valley, the Luray Valley, until you get to Harrisonburg and Conrad's Store, then it's one valley again, okay? And what happens is Jackson orders Ewell's command to move north from Swift Run Gap through the Luray Valley. Jackson begins moving up the Shenandoah Valley, and as they're moving north, they're going to try to deliver a blow to defeat Nathaniel Banks' army. The first blow is delivered at Front Royal. Jackson's command crosses Massanutten Mountain at New Market Gap and links up with Ewell's command. Together they have 14,000 men, where they fall upon a 1,000-man contingent commanded by John Kenly, which is composed largely of Marylanders, which is a matter of great interest to the 1st Maryland Confederate Regiment that is in Jackson's command, who insists on having the honor of leading the attack on Front Royal and showing Marylanders what Marylanders can do if they're wearing the right uniform, which is not hard to do if you've got a 14-to-1 advantage, right? Okay? And this is what happens. Now, when Jackson's command attack and overrun Kenly's command at Front Royal, this is a serious problem for Banks because his army is now at Strasburg, and the railroad connecting Strasburg to Manassas Junction, the Manassas Gap Railroad, Front Royal is on that railroad, and once Jackson is there, he has cut Banks off from eastern Virginia. In addition, he's in a position where he can attack Winchester, which would cut Banks off from the Potomac River. And Banks recognizes what he has to do, begins retreating back toward Winchester. Jackson tries to cut him off, and there's some fighting at Middletown, but is unable to do so. But then Jackson is able to have Ewell's command attack Banks' left, while Jackson himself attacks Banks' right at the Battle of First Winchester. Banks is defeated. His troops go fleeing through Winchester, where the delighted residents fire pot shots and throw stuff at the Federals as they're running, and then bring out flowers and food for the Confederates when they show up. And they cheer them, and Jackson later says, it's one of the most stirring scenes of my life. And Jackson, and of course Banks leaves behind thousands, millions of dollars worth of supplies, several thousand prisoners, which leads the Confederates to name him Commissary Banks. Step forward. All right. And Jackson decides to continue pushing north all the way to the Potomac River and seeing if he can capture Harper's Ferry. He'll have to wait a couple months to do that, right? He's not going to do it here. But while Jackson does this, the news of the Winchester and Front Royal disasters have reached Washington, D.C. And Lincoln decides, okay, the plan for it, and the timing. McDowell's command on May the 23rd, Lincoln is at Fredericksburg. He's meeting with McDowell. Everybody's happy, laughy, and jokey because McDowell's getting ready that week to head south and join McClellan's army. And as McDowell's men begin moving south, they get a message from Washington. There's been a disaster with Banks' command. The move south is suspended. They send a message to McClellan, who obviously is going to be unhappy about this as well. Instead, Lincoln has the idea to send part of McDowell's command, Shields' division, back to the Shenandoah Valley. And if it can enter the Shenandoah Valley at Manassas Gap or the railroad at Front Royal, and if Fremont's command can enter the Shenandoah Valley from the west, then they might be able to cut Jackson's command off and destroy it. And McDowell is not too crazy about this idea because he thinks it's going to fail, which is probably not the best mindset to have going into an operation, but McDowell's going to be vindicated. Essentially, Jackson's command, through some truly heroic marching, are going to be able to fall back, avoid the jaws closing on him, and then retreat all the way back up the Shenandoah Valley to the southern end at Harrisonburg. They are aided in part by some very, very fortunate weather. As Fremont's commanders pursuing Jackson's command west of Massanutten Mountain, they very nearly caught Jackson's command when the Shenandoah River, they built a pontoon bridge, they're ready to attack Jackson's tired command, when a huge rainstorm floods the river and washes out the bridge, and Fremont's men have to wait a critical 12 hours before they can go after Jackson, by which time Jackson has escaped and reached Harrisonburg. Click again, because time. Okay, after Jackson's at Harrisonburg, he identifies Port Republic as the key point on the map, as a place for the ultimate destination for his command, because once he's at Port Republic, you have Shields' command advancing down the Ray Valley from Front Royal, Fremont's command advancing south from Strasburg on the west side of Massanutten Mountain, and from Port Republic, Jackson can have interior lines and deal with them one at a time. Now, initially, the first engagement that takes place south of Massanutten Mountain takes place at Harrisonburg on the 6th of June, which is largely fought by cavalry. There is a fellow in Fremont's command by the name of Percy Wyndham, Sir Percy Wyndham, who has served in the British Army, the French Army, the Italian Army, and been, I think, in the French Navy as well to boot. And he has bragged, he's heard about Turner Ashby, who is Jackson's cavalry commander, and boasted he would capture Turner Ashby. Well, when he's leading the cavalry pursuit of Fremont's army after Jackson's command, and he sees Confederate cavalry at just east of Harrisonburg at a place called Chestnut Ridge, Percy Wyndham decides with more aggressiveness than judgment to make a bold cavalry charge, and Sir Percy gets captured by the Confederates. There's back and forth fighting. Jackson sends Ewell's command back to help Ashby out, and they're able to defeat the Federals, but Ashby is killed in this battle. 2 days later, Jackson leaves Richard Ewell behind at a place called Cross Keys to deal with Fremont's command, and he's able to defeat Fremont. Fremont launches a series of attacks at Ewell's position, but is unable to break through. This gives Jackson time to fight off a raid by some Federals, commanded by Samuel Carroll. They very nearly captured Jackson himself at Port Republic on the 8th of June. But this raid is fought off, and that night Jackson orders Ewell to join the rest of the army at Port Republic, and they deal with the lead element of Shields' command, which is led by Robert Tyler. And this is the Battle of Port Republic. The Confederates launch a series of assaults that initially are unsuccessful because the Federals hold possession of a piece of high ground called the Coaling. And up here, you are on the coaling, and the Confederates are initially attacking here, and the Federals from this position are able to fire on and defeat the Confederate assaults. Then Richard Taylor's Louisiana Brigade launches a series of assaults in the coaling. Once they capture the coaling, Tyler's command is forced to retreat, and Jackson's essentially ended the Shenandoah Valley campaign with yet another victory. And after this, of course, Jackson is going to be sent. After this, Shields is ordered to head back to Front Royal, go back to McDowell's command, so they can go back to the plan of having McDowell join McClellan. But by the time Shields arrives at McDowell's command, his division is so broken down, it is so exhausted, that it's going to be several weeks before they can do anything, which gives Lee time to bring Jackson's command to Richmond and attack McClellan's army successfully at the 7 days battles. All right, click. And then when we look back at Jackson's campaign, the assessments of it, one of the soldiers declares, this must make Jackson the great. Remember, Jackson's first significant operations independent command are going to be the Romney Campaign in Kearnstown. And there were considerable doubts and questions raised about Jackson's military leadership after those operations. But after this, here are some of the assessments. P. Edlow Jones carries us back to the chivalric days of yore. Pretty cool. Robert K. Crick, who I heard mentioned earlier, who wrote a great book just on Port Republic and Cross Keys. Campaign marched by astounding marches, skillful use of terrain, cunning employment of interior lines. Whether he'd achieved invincibility, his soldiers had confidence in him. Richard Ewell, who had complained about Jackson's refusal to take his subordinates into his confidence, which Ewell found frustrating initially, but eventually figured out how to work under Jackson. Later says, yeah, Conrad's story, I called him an old woman. Not very gender nice. Okay. Get in trouble with his local sexual harassment person. Okay. Well, I take it all back. Old Jackson's a fool. And then Samuel Sexton, who was in the Federal Army, his assessment is the problem of the Federal Army is too many major generals and not enough brains. I've worked for the Army for over 15 years. I'll let that comment end this presentation. So, send it forward. All right, thank you very much. I'll be glad to answer your questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had a question, not about campaign, but about your school. Wasn't that the postgraduate school that Dwight Eisenhower attended? And if so, where did he finish?
What's that?
At the Army Command and General Staff School, wasn't that the one that General Eisenhower
Yep.
attended?
We have, the Army education has 3 levels, education system is. One's the pre-commissioning, West Point, ROTC, OCS. So they prepare you for the first 10 years of your career. We call it tactical leadership, direct leadership, where you're working with troops directly. Our school comes 10 years into their career, and it's designed to get them to the next 10 years of their career when they're called organizational leaders. They're going to have less direct leadership, more working within an organization. And they're supposed to think operational as opposed to tactical. Tactical level, their focus is on, if they're an infantryman, they're an infantryman. They're an artilleryman, they're an artilleryman. If they're civil affairs, they're civil affairs, right? If they're military intelligence, they're military intelligence. When they come to our school, it's also called the Combined Arms Center. So they're supposed to begin rising above their narrow branch focuses and start working with people from other branches so they can combine arms at the operational level. After our school, if they're going on beyond that, there's the Army War College in Carlisle. And Eisenhower did attend CGSC, Command General Staff College. And he's a West Point graduate in 1915. He missed the Great War, and he figured, okay, my career's done. And most accounts, he's an interested officer, interested profession. But again, there's questions, 1920s, 1930s, what's the point of having the Army, right? Because, we're not going to do World War I again. An idiot would send an army to the continent of Europe again, right? Okay? But but the United States does have responsibilities around the world in Latin America, and he's linked up with an officer by the name of Fox Connor. And Fox Connor really encourages Eisenhower to take his profession seriously, to study military history, and Eisenhower always loved military history. Who doesn't, right? Okay? He encouraged Eisenhower to take seriously his studies, helped him prepare for the Command General Staff College, and when Eisenhower finishes first class at CGSC, that becomes a big stepping. That's a big point when people start saying, hey, Eisenhower is a cut above the other officers around him. And this helps him with Marshall because George Marshall, who's going to be picking the commanders, he has a good relationship with Fox Connor, and Fox Connor says this Eisenhower's a good guy, as demonstrated by how well he did at Command General Staff College. So Eisenhower's going to stay a major forever, but he gets jumped from major to brigadier general like that when Marshall decides he needs someone bright to run the War Plans Division. So CGSC is very important in Eisenhower's career. And what helped him also get through the school was George Patton helped him with his notes from the classes, right? Which is, again, it's a very important part in Eisenhower's career. And of course, he retires to Gettysburg. So, yes, sir.
Jackson's Valley campaign has often been compared to Napoleon's campaign in Italy of 1796-97. Is there any evidence that Jackson, either at West Point or afterwards, made a special study of Napoleon's Italian campaign?
None that he studied that specifically. Again, at West Point, they didn't study military history back then. They, as I'm sure you've had given presentations at West Point before. West Point was an engineering school, and it trained lieutenants and engineers. That was its purpose. And the Germany stuff, that's kind of been overrated. I mean, a lot of Germany stuff is common sense, right? I mean, that's one of the things we do in our classes when we do study Germany and Clausewitz is war is a political act. Well, duh, okay? There's fog and friction. Yeah, Clausewitz, yeah, duh, okay? But there's so much focus on engineering in their studies, in French studies and things like that. They had very little liberal arts, very little military history. Dennis Hart Mahan taught devoted a couple hours to military strategy, but wasn't really enough to really shape their minds. What really shaped a lot of officers' minds, of course, was their experience on the frontier. And the experience on the frontier was dealing with the Native Americans. It was power projection. It was logistics. And it was dealing with troublesome tribes. Which, if you're trying to think what you can do in the Civil War, for the North, you're going to be projecting power. Logistics are going to be very important. And you're dealing with troublesome tribes. Only instead of Choctaw, they're called South Carolinians. Okay? So, but there is the fact that the Civil War is so scaled up in that regard. Studying specific Napoleonic campaigns, I don't have any specific evidence that Jackson did that. But of course, anybody who's interested in the military would have studied the Napoleonic Wars. But to a large extent, what he does in the Valley Campaign is, if you're in a situation like this, you don't need Napoleon to tell you that if you got more guys, you got 50,000 guys who could be operating against you, it's better to take them on in smaller contingents rather than all at once before they can combine themselves. So again, a lot of the study of strategy is basically common sense. Of course, wanting to do something is one thing, actually being able to do it is another. And that's what Napoleon's campaigns are. His campaigns in Italy are less interesting for the military campaign, the maneuver, but just the way Napoleon takes this army that is demoralized and broken down and inspires it to do these great things. And it's a great leadership study in that sense. But Jackson as a leader, he's got some problems inspiring his men because he's just, until he's successful, then affection comes with results. And that didn't answer your question, but did.
Well, the siege of Mantua, the maneuvers around there, Napoleon had often compared. And people weren't using interior lines like Napoleon until Napoleon did, for the most part. So he sort of popularized the use of interior lines and defeating the enemy in detail. And, did Jackson make a study of these things to try and be inspired by that or talk to people?
Except when Napoleon operated on exterior lines by using maneuver and things like that, right? And that's the Napoleonic thing. There's no one Napoleonic formula because he does different things at different times. Sometimes he takes interior lines. Other times the other guy's got interior lines, and he still beats him using the other guy using interior lines, which leaves his opponents going, "Hey, you used interior lines last time to beat me. I used interior lines this time, and you beat me again." So there's something more than just simply being the interior lines. It's what goes behind it, and that's what Jackson provided. I mean, he could have had interior lines, but the Federals perhaps managed their resources better. Might not have been such an advantage. Yes.
So following up on that is Jackson just using common sense against less than great thinkers, or is he a strategic genius in this campaign?
In this campaign, he achieves these amazing operational results, which is the whole federal plan for when the campaign season begins in 1862, the Confederates are on the defensive, and this gives the Federals the opportunity, throughout the Confederacy, to pick and choose where they're going to carry out their offensive operations. The Confederates are constantly looking for an opportunity to counterattack, to counteroffensive, but they don't have the resources to do it until the Federals overextend themselves. And this is what happens in the Shenandoah Valley. When Banks's command defeats Jackson at Kearnstown, Banks's command is fine because it's got good logistical systems to sustain it. But the problem if he just sits there at Strasburg, he sets him up for something that Jackson did to defeat him. But if Banks heads further south to Harrisonburg, he might push Jackson back, but his logistical system is overextended and he can't push any further south. So what certainly happens is the Federals, and this is a pattern that plays out, the Federals get initial operational success on the offensive, but there's a point where logistics and inertia and just the friction you encounter forces the Federals to pause or arrest their momentum. And this gives the Confederates the opportunity to launch counterattacks. And this happens out west at Shiloh, and this happens in the east here. And you can kind of see it in the 1864 campaigns, right? Grant initially has offensive operational initiative. He uses it. He achieves operational. But there's a point at which he reaches a point where he can't push much further. You have that with Sherman as well. Initially, he can maneuver to Atlanta, but once you reach Atlanta, logistics and the natural friction of war slow things up and give the Confederates opportunities to launch counterattacks. So it's this basic reality of logistics, this tyranny of logistics, that causes the Federals, once they take the offense, to eventually have to slow down and stop and pause, that gives the Confederates the opportunity for counterattacks. And that's way more than you asked, but that's... And that's why you have to study the entire campaign as a whole, not just the Valley campaign. Cousins' book and Tanner's book are very good in the campaign. The book I have coming out next year, promotion, okay, looks at the Virginia campaign in '62 as a whole, okay. So, and it was difficult because when you're focusing on the Shenandoah Valley campaign, you can study the Shenandoah Valley campaign, and something's happened on the peninsula. But the way the peninsula, McDowell's command, and Jackson's command are all, it's a nervous system. It's a system of systems. If something happens in one part of the system, it has ripples elsewhere in the system. So studying the whole campaign holistically, one, it's made the manuscript much longer than the publisher wanted, but it helps me understand this dynamic that's happening. The Federals initially in 1862, they're operationally effective. By the end of May, McClellan's moving toward the gates of Richmond. McDowell has seized Fredericksburg. Banks has pushed south to Harrisonburg, and the Confederates have been pushed back and are falling back on all fronts. And then all three of the Federals start to stall, largely because of logistical and just the basic inertia of power, just the problem of power projection, and dealing with the natural and environmental problems they got to deal with. And it's kind of like, with a spring, right? Once you push, the spring becomes overextended, then the other springs got the offensive ability. And that's kind of what happens there.
Do you think Jackson himself would have had the same problem as he pushed down the valley?
Oh, yeah.
Early in January?
And again, what Lincoln is seeing is once he says, okay, we got kind of overextended when we sent Banks all the way down to Harrisonburg, and it created the ability for the Confederates to attack us successfully. Well, now he's at Harper's Ferry. He's overextended as well. So that creates an opportunity for us to potentially pinch him off. So you have they're kind of looking at the situation kind of the same way. Yes, sir.
Is your book also talking about there's two more small offensives going on too? Isn't it like Hague's trying to get through Princeton Courthouse, and I think Garfield's done his book swing up through southwestern Virginia as well too. It's like two more small armies at the same time. Trying to go down into Tennessee. I think there's like 5 little armies. And
you've got Carter's raid, which is trying to get down there. They're trying. Again, the initial plan was Buell would advance from Louisville to Knoxville. And which is, okay, that sounds interesting because there are all the Tennessee Unionists there. But there are Tennessee Unionists there for a reason. And the reason is the mountains are underdeveloped economically, so they're not tied into the cotton culture, so they're logistically very immature. The fact that they're logistically immature means there's also problem for military operations, because how do you get an army in there? When Buell makes his first push towards East Tennessee in early '62, that's what leads to the Battle of Mill Springs, in which Thomas wins a victory. But after the victory, they look at the roads and they say, we can't get to East Tennessee. And so that's when Buell moves west towards Nashville, more towards central Tennessee, because you can get to the railroad, take the railroad to Chattanooga. But the railroad creates its own logistical problems as well. And so they come, okay, maybe we can't get an army in there, maybe we can do little raids down there. And so you've got all these kind of ideas for how do we get into East Tennessee when an army big enough to occupy East Tennessee can't be logistically sustained in East Tennessee until you've got huge swaths of the rest of Tennessee and Kentucky taken over. So the East Tennessee is an operational problem. And again, Lincoln's idea is, well, then just Fremont will, if he moves in the Shenandoah Valley, then he can take the Shenandoah Valley down to Knoxville. That's the basic idea. Perhaps Banks might link up with them, but Banks has also got the responsibility that he's got to protect the line, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And it's this complicated operational problem. And Lincoln's trying to coordinate all this, and Stanton are trying to coordinate all this. And it's a really, really hard problem to solve. Yep.
Doesn't Jackson really benefit from the fact that most of the Union generals are either politicals or mediocrities who don't have a lot of background in the logistics from Mexico and out west, whereas the Union generals who do understand the logistics of it are all in the West, like Grant, Thomas, and Sherman.
One story said that the difference between the East and the West is, in 1861 and 62, is out west the rivers favor the Union, whereas in the East the rivers favor the Confederacy. Now McClellan tries to bypass and say, okay, well, if we're just willing to remove forces from in front of Washington, then we can use the rivers for us. But then that creates a problem. God was protecting Washington. And Lincoln is trying to move these pins on a map, okay, and sometimes has no sense of, okay, if I move this pin here, okay. A key example of this is John C. Fremont's the proposal for John C. Fremont to help cut off Jackson. Lincoln's initial suggestion to Fremont is he's at a place called Franklin, which is in West Virginia now, but there's a road from Franklin to Harrisonburg, and so the idea is. He says that Fremont, you should take that road to Harrisonburg because you'll be well south of Jackson, and you'll be sure to cut him off. The problem is, so Fremont does try to use that road, but if Lincoln could see that on a map, the Confederates can see that on a map, and they have gunked up the road. So Fremont says, okay, yes, boss, I'll do this, and he finds I can't go. And he's got to backtrack and take another route, and he misses Jackson by 1 day. But if you read the account of the army, they're marching through the roads of West Virginia, which is you go through. You try to sustain an army there in these mountain valleys and things like that. It's a very, very hard case. If you want a significant army, Civil War army, you got to have a railroad, you got to have a river, one of those two things, and you don't have those in Western Virginia. So it puts a limit on how large your forces are. It puts a limit on how you can sustain them. And when they've got to move suddenly, it's okay, we'll sustain them. They set up some logistical system of wagon trains that are going back and forth. These long wagon trains that take several days to go back, several days to come make reinforcement. And then Lincoln says, oh, I want you guys to turn on a dime and go do this. And he's like, well, we've sent the wagons back, and the wagons need to come up. And they think we're going to be here, and now you're saying we need to be here. There's a gap between this and this. We can only do this. And John Pope counters this in. He initially comes east and he says, "I'm not going to worry about the rail. I'll let the railroad run itself." And then he finds out railroads need schedules. And you can't improvise with a railroad and say, okay, yesterday I know I said I wanted 7 train locomotives and 7 cars back that way, but today I want 9 cars to come this way, and today I might change that. So you railroad guys can handle that, correct? And the railroad guys, well, this is our plan. We are sending 7 railroad cars to you tomorrow. They will have this much stuff in it. You will offload it this way. And if you don't offload it this way, I cannot tell you that the schedule will be met. And so it's boring, dull stuff. But it's what makes an army run and makes an army move is guys filling out paperwork. And John C. Fremont can't understand. Lincoln can't understand that. It's just these complicated logistical problems. And when George McClellan's got it, he's got background in logistics, and he gets the peninsula. I was talking about the book that on the climate and stuff like that. The climate and the weather in the peninsula. I mean, McClellan's army suffers huge casualties from sickness, and they're trying their best to manage this problem. But who could have known it would be the worst weather in a generation on the peninsula? Who knew there'd be what the hell is an El Nino? Right? I mean, that's we were talking about earlier. Ken No is writing some essays on there's some books on the Peninsula Campaign. That suggests there was probably an El Nino or La Nina weather pattern that year. That made the weather unusual. So even if you've done your research, what is typical weather in Virginia? Okay, typical weather is this. And someone says, well, El Nino. What? Oh, yeah, I remember Mexico. Boy, that hurt my stomach probably really badly. That's what the response would be. So, again, all these different planning considerations that they've got to come into. And it's much harder on the offensive because as the offensive goes, it puts more land behind it, which creates different supply patterns, whereas you fall back. And this is not just the Civil War. When we look at, the Blitzkrieg operations in World War II, okay, there's a chain for Blitzkrieg, okay? You can go a couple hundred miles, but then the chain yanks at you, okay? And you're stuck, right? And with the chain, once your chain is tight, your range of mobility also tightens up as well. Whereas someone falls back on their chain, okay, they get slack, so they've got more room for maneuver. And so that's why you see North Africa, they're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, because the Germans chase the British, and the British chain gains slack, and the German chain loses slack, and then the Germans are kind of stuck, and then the British do a counterattack, and next thing you know, the German chain is the British chain is extending, while the German chain is getting more slack in it. So this logistics is a big piece of military history. As I said, more armies have died of starvation and disease than have died of bullets. Okay, because just the challenge of keeping armies. That's way too long. Sorry about that. Okay.
Well, it's really what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
I recall when we went to Atlanta, I did some reading about how much work Sherman did.
Mm-hmm. And
Planning the Atlanta.
Yeah, we were talking. I was at a conference last month in which someone was talking about the Atlanta campaign and the psychological warfare of the March to the Sea, which is there is that part of it, but there is also the logistical piece to it that Sherman simply I can't sustain my army off of this railroad any longer. Okay, after Atlanta, Hood maneuvers against his railroad, and Sherman's got to go chase back if I'm going to maintain my railroad. He says, well, if I just march to the sea and eat everything and don't stop, then, and I'll get to the ocean, and then ships can feed me. But there's a lot of logistical thinking behind these marches as well. And it's just, okay, but yeah, logistics is a big thing.
So how did Jackson overcome his logistics?
How did Jackson overcome his logistics? Well, when the campaign begins, it begins largely with him falling back. So he falls back on his logistical base. Then when he attacks Banks and he heads north toward the Potomac River, it's more along the lines of a raiding operation than a plan to stay permanently. He knows he's going to have to fall back at some point. Perhaps I can capture Sharpshire Ferry. Perhaps I can do something else. But he knows he's got to fall back eventually. And so, as once he does that, he's once again falling back on his base, running back towards Conrad's store. But I mean, it's Jackson's men will say, he demanded a lot of us, both in terms of our marching, in terms of not getting fed as much as we would like to, and it helps that when you march and you attack the Federals and the Federals run, the first thing the Federals leave behind is supplies. Okay, and you can live off of those for a while. If your horse, you can now have horses that have U.S. stamped on them, and that's a good thing that can be accomplished through raids. And that's just what I said. What people argue Lee was doing in the Gettysburg campaign. The battle was kind of incidental. What he was trying to do was to raid Pennsylvania and send everything back to Virginia to sustain his army through another winter. And that's kind of Kent Masters and Brown's book makes that big argument there, looking at logistical records and things like that. Kind of things people are like, look at Quartermaster's records. Oh man, nobody's making Gods and Generals the Quartermaster version. Hell in triplicate, right? Okay.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are on Lincoln's criticism of McClellan.
On whose?
McClellan.
Oh, criticism of McClellan? Yeah. Okay, how much time do we have? McClellan is a complicated person, is a complicated figure. When he does things well, he does things very, very well. When he does things badly, he does things very, very badly. And his you can't get away from the issues with his personality. The thing that strikes me about McClellan is just how young he is when he gets all this responsibility shoved on him. He's not even old enough to be president. He's given command over all the Union armies. And people are talking about him as a future president. And people talk about him developing an ego. I don't see how somebody could have, I don't see how anybody could have said, I will take these responsibilities. Somebody needed to take these responsibilities without thinking I have the ego to do this. And then people say, oh, you can do these responsibilities. Nobody else can do it. And he just gets puffed up with his ego. He also has an unhealthy attitude towards civil military relations, and this is a legacy of the antebellum army. The antebellum army, the United States Army is developing institutionally into a more professional force, and part of the professionalization process is defining there are some things you have to be an expert at, and therefore you need professional leaders for. Warfare is one of them. Amateurs stay out. And they look back to the Mexican War, in which James K. Polk, for petty, personal, and partisan reasons, holds back Winfield Scott from the field, takes troops from Zachary Taylor, makes appointments to command that are designed to advance the Democratic Party as opposed to advance the war effort. Now, one thing Winfield Scott's able to do is overcome that. And one of the ways he does that is by relying heavily on these West Point trained staff officers. He said, my division commanders are all a bunch of political hacks. Okay, I got a solution to that problem. I will put a West Point guy on their staff, and they will say, no, General, the trenches go this way. Okay? And what this does is and the West Pointers come out of the war having reinforced in this idea that war is too important for politicians to be involved in. And, kind of turning Clemenceau's war is too important left to generals on its head. But there's a sense that that we understand logistics. We understand the complications of running armies. You guys can win elections by stirring up the people all you want, but leave this to the professionals. And as long as the professionals are agreeing with George McClellan, like Lincoln did initially, he's going to have a great relationship with Lincoln. If Lincoln starts questioning him or raising issues, McClellan's going to say, back off. This stay in your lane, boss. Okay? Which is a problem because in warfare, politics and the conduct of operations overlap each other, and it creates a potentially dangerous problem. We recently did Civil War Monitor recently had the Grant Lee issue out, and it asked what was Grant's best decision. And my answer wasn't one decision. It was the skill with which he played Abraham Lincoln. Okay, his ability. And one reason he's able to do that is because he has the example of what happened to McClellan before him, what happened to people who came before him. You have to keep the president happy. If you're going to do something the president doesn't like, Let the president think it's something he agrees with, okay? If Robert Todd Lincoln wants to wear a uniform, okay, Mary Todd Lincoln might freak out. And she will freak out about many things, okay? But if I put him on a staff, he can wear a uniform, Mary Todd Lincoln won't be upset. And if the president says, I've got to do this with my military operations, I will do this, but you know, things happen in the course of military operations, and when the president doesn't know, won't hurt him, okay? So McClellan, he has a civil military problem, and his big problem is Lincoln never agrees with the Peninsula strategy. He just never agrees with it. The second McClellan presents it to him, saying, we're taking the army from Washington, and we're going to advance on from the lower Chesapeake. We'll conduct joint operations. We've got a Navy they don't. Lincoln immediately says, I don't like this idea. It leaves Washington, who's going to be here to protect Washington? Who's going to defend Washington? And my Republican politicians are saying, you're not trustworthy anyway, and aren't you a former Democrat? What would a Democrat do? Oh, he'd leave Washington open to be captured. Makes sense, right? So they never liked McClellan's plan, and the management of McDowell's unit, in response to what Jackson is doing in the Valley, reinforces the friction between McClellan. McClellan believes, and it's sort of said, Lincoln lets it be known to so many people he does not like the Peninsula strategy. You could almost come to the conclusion he's given himself a perverse incentive in seeing it fail. Okay? Because if it succeeds, and you've been telling everybody you think it's going to fail, I think there's you can see how McClellan and generals who tend to be inclined towards a victim mentality when it comes towards politicians anyway, how that could be exacerbated by that situation. And when the question of the war is loyalty in and of itself to the Union, you've got a really toxic atmosphere. And to a certain extent, McClellan is dealing with a strategic problem that probably can't be solved in 1862 anyway. So there's a problem. Once you can use the Peninsula Campaign to get yourself close to Richmond, but it's very hard to actually capture Richmond because of the way the logistical network is around Richmond, the way the James River is. As you get closer to Richmond, it becomes much more difficult. In the past, I've been a big enthusiast of the Peninsula strategy, but the more I studied it, it gets you close to Richmond, but not there. And to sustain yourself in front of Richmond means you're surrendering the initiative to the Confederates, which is the problem in this campaign. Once they surrender the initiative to Confederates, then they're in trouble. And again, Grant's thing is, in 64, 65, he's not operating against Richmond itself, he's operating against Petersburg, but even then it takes 9 freaking months. And again, Lincoln learned some lessons by
Does that prove McClellan correct?
I have suggested that in the past many times. That the James, and again, Lee reads it the same way. The James River, in order to say we've won the war in Virginia, you have to capture Richmond at some point. Okay, and the problem is if you try to advance from the north, you've got all kinds of logistical problems, railroads and rivers. You try to approach from the east, you can get close. But it's not until these armies really worn down, that it takes 3-4 years of war, that you can finally, and all the other things that have happened in the West and everything like that. So in 62, I just don't think the Union can solve this problem. McClellan makes mistakes. Okay, he makes mistakes. I mean, he should have been nicer to Abraham Lincoln. Yes. Okay. Yes. Nothing wrong with him writing nasty letters to his wife about his boss. Okay. Oh, yeah. I never complain about my boss. Yeah. Okay. I'm sure someone's mentioned George Thomas at her table, right? George Thomas is when his wife burned their correspondence after the war. Okay. Some things not to be left behind. And McClellan never tended for those letters to his wife. But again, I complain all the time to my wife. And I don't do it in letters. She's right there. But for McClellan, who was separated from his wife,
keep the boss waiting in the lobby.
Yeah, I mean you do that, and McClellan could have been nicer to Lincoln. He could have been like Grant and said, "Hey, I understand you need these things," instead of simply saying, "Hey, butt out, dude." Not that McClellan said "dude," but But there was tensions developing in the relationship, and this suggested that the snubbing of Lincoln in November was an effort by McClellan to try to reestablish some boundaries. Okay, like, hey man, don't come over here all the time. Okay. But again, it's a complicated relationship. It's a two-way relationship. All the faults are not on one side, and it's a big problem, the McClellan-Lincoln thing. And again, 62, people are to a large they're learning things in 62. The problems the Army of the Potomac has in keeping its physical health when it's operating against Richmond. You know, no one had ever had 100,000 men. Richmond's not 100,000 population. Nobody ever had 100,000 men east of Richmond and said, let's find out what happens if we can feed those people. Until McClellan tries it, and then you get all kinds of sickness and disease. And there's some reorganization they have to do of the medical department that takes place during the war, because they're learning a lot of things. They knew a lot going in, as I mentioned before. They know a lot about the important logistics. They know a lot about power projection. But on the scale of the Civil War, it just was not something that had been done before. And even if you study the German War of 1866, which sort of provides a contrast in which the Prussians win in 7 weeks and defeat Austria. By the time the Prussians get to the decisive battlefield at Kenningrates, there are logistical breakdowns happening all over the place. So even the great spiky helmeted general staff Prussians find themselves in problems. The railroad manager guys have problems managing logistics in the field. It's a big problem. You can draw stuff on arrows, but then someone's going to say, you need railroad here. The railroad's not here. Okay, how do we solve that problem? Yes, sir.
Didn't the Germans will eventually triumph because of their superiority with those needle guns?
The Germans triumph because after they win the battle, Bismarck says, okay, war over. Okay? War over.
We won.
Well, not necessarily we won, but war over, and Austrians, we don't want anything from you. Okay? Abraham Lincoln can't say, we won battle, we want nothing from you Confederates, because what they want from the Confederacy is the total surrender of the Confederacy. Okay? That's a big difference. That's a big difference. I mean, if Bismarck had said, I want the Austrian Empire to go away, the Austrian emperor would never have surrendered after one battle. But Bismarck makes it easy for his opponents to quit, and so they quit after losing a battle, and that ends the war quickly. And when the Germans get into situations where the other guy doesn't quit, then they face serious problems. The Poles quit, the French quit. When the Russians don't, then the Germans have a serious problem on their hands that they can't solve.
I get the last one?
All right.
They asked it last night about Winchester.
What?
So how many times did it change?
How many times did Winchester change hands? Lots. Okay. Again, I've read numbers as high as 70. But my question, what are you counting? I mean, was there a day when there wasn't a Union soldier in it, or there was no Union Confederate soldiers in it? A Union soldier went in one day and then went back to his camp. Does that count as a day? You do have the 3 significant battles. First Winchester during this campaign, second Winchester in the march up to Gettysburg, and then you have the Battle of Third Winchester. And significantly, Philip Sheridan wins his victories in the Shenandoah Valley north before Massanutten Mountain becomes a significant operational problem. The best place to fight in the Shenandoah Valley is around Winchester. The problem is the Union Army is around Winchester. It's only around Winchester. It's like, and you start thinking, why can't you capture more of the valley? And that's where logistics comes in and plays there. And so Sheridan figures, okay, we won't occupy that part of the valley. We'll just burn it, and okay, nobody gets it. Okay, and again, Jubal Early's got the same problem. Once he's up fighting around Winchester and fighting around Strasburg and trying to move to Potomac, that's when he's vulnerable because his logistics can't really keep up with him. And Sheridan can punch good. Once they get further south, Sheridan has a problem punching until, Early has punched himself in the face so many times that he's ready to fall. All these things are so freaking complicated. Unless you just want to go, yay, good guy, boo, bad guy. And again, even Banks, Fremont, and Shields, and McDowell, and all these guys. So who won the Gallagher collection of essays on the Valley? That's got a great essay in it by Bill Miller on the federal leadership in the campaign. I think it's the best essay in that book. And it talks about, hey, these guys have this problem. Lincoln has asked them to do a lot out of his own inexperience. They're trying to accommodate the president's wishes, but between HQ and Washington, I don't want to give too much away, but sometimes between HQ and Washington and what's happening in the field, there are breakdowns in communication and misunderstandings. Even today, when they can VTC in and everything like that, generals don't tell the president everything, and the president sometimes asks things that aren't always